The fastest way to lose someone is to spend years acting like they will never leave. My name is Nathan Cole, and the night my wife set me free, she thought she was making a joke. It was a Saturday evening in late October, the kind of Colorado night where the air turns crisp after sunset and the mountains disappear into the darkness beyond the city lights. Victoria had invited several friends over for what she called a casual wine night. Our house was full of laughter, expensive candles, and the familiar sound of people enjoying themselves. I had spent most of the evening in my home office finishing paperwork from a commercial renovation project. Around 9 o'clock, I walked toward the kitchen to grab a bottle of water. I was not trying to listen to anyone. I was not looking for trouble. In fact, I was looking forward to going upstairs, taking a shower, and getting some sleep before another busy week. Then I heard my wife say something that stopped me in the hallway. His presence irritates me. Honestly, I wish he would disappear forever. The room exploded with laughter. Her friends laughed. Victoria laughed. Someone made another comment I could not quite hear. More laughter followed. I stood completely still. The strange thing about moments that change your life is that they rarely announce themselves. There was no dramatic music, no warning, no feeling that the world had stopped spinning. The refrigerator still hummed. Glasses still clinked in the living room. Somewhere outside, a car drove past our neighborhood. Everything continued exactly as it had 1 minute earlier. Yet nothing would ever be the same again. I wish I could tell you I felt angry. I wish I could tell you I stormed into the room and demanded an explanation. That would probably make a better story. But the truth is different. The truth is that I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not immediately. At first there was shock. Then sadness. Then a strange sense of clarity began to settle over me. Looking back now, I think those words only hurt because they confirmed what I had already known for years. Victoria and I had not been partners for a long time. We had become roommates sharing a mortgage, a schedule, and a collection of old memories. Somewhere along the road, she stopped seeing me. Not all at once. Slowly, quietly, the way a photograph fades after years in direct sunlight. I stood in that hallway listening to the conversation continue. Nobody knew I was there. Nobody knew I had heard every word. Victoria sounded comfortable, relaxed, the way people sound when they believe they are speaking the truth. That realization hurt more than the sentence itself. She was not trying to be cruel. She genuinely felt that way. I quietly grabbed my water and returned to my office. The house felt different as I walked through it. The framed family photographs on the walls. The furniture we spent months choosing together. The hardwood floors I installed myself years earlier. Everything suddenly looked like part of someone else's life. I sat behind my desk and stared at the computer screen without reading a single word. Outside the office window, the backyard was illuminated by a single security light. Fallen leaves drifted across the grass whenever the wind picked up. The scene felt calm, peaceful even. Meanwhile, my marriage was ending 20 feet away. What I did not know then was that this would become the most important night of my life. Not because I lost something, because I finally stopped fighting for something that had already been lost. For years I had tried harder, worked harder, given more, sacrificed more, explained more, hoping that eventually things would improve, hoping that eventually Victoria would see me the way she once had. Sitting alone in that quiet office, I realized something simple. You cannot convince someone to value you. And the moment you stop trying is the moment you begin finding yourself again. Down the hallway, laughter continued. Upstairs, our bedroom waited exactly as I had left it. The house looked the same. My life looked the same. But as I sat there listening to distant voices through the walls, I made a decision that Victoria would not discover for many months. She thought she was insulting me that night. She had no idea she had just given me permission to leave. Nobody wakes up one morning and becomes invisible. It happens slowly. So slowly, in fact, that by the time you realize it has happened, you cannot remember exactly when it started. The morning after Victoria's gathering, I woke up at 5:30 as usual. The Colorado sky outside was still dark, and a thin layer of frost covered the backyard fence. I walked downstairs, started a pot of coffee, and sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Upstairs, Victoria was still asleep. Looking back now, I think that morning was the first time I stopped asking how to save my marriage and started asking whether there was anything left to save at all. For most of my adult life, I had measured success by responsibility. I built my company from the ground up. The first years were brutal. Long days, tight budgets, endless uncertainty. I spent weekends on job sites and evenings reviewing contracts at the kitchen table. Not because I loved working every hour of the day, but because I wanted to create stability. I wanted a life where my wife never had to worry about whether the mortgage would be paid or whether the lights would stay on. When Victoria wanted to pursue a bigger career, I supported her completely. When she worked late nights preparing presentations, I handled dinner. When she traveled for conferences, I took care of everything at home. None of it felt extraordinary to me. That was simply what partners did. At least that was what I believed. Somewhere along the way, however, appreciation quietly disappeared. Not in a dramatic way. Not through arguments or betrayal. It faded the way daylight fades in winter. Gradually. Almost invisibly. I remember a charity event 3 years earlier. Victoria had just received a major promotion. Hundreds of people filled a luxury hotel ballroom in downtown Denver. Executives, investors, and business leaders moved through the crowd exchanging handshakes and business cards. I arrived after finishing a site inspection and changing into the only tailored suit I owned. At one point, I joined a conversation Victoria was having with several colleagues. One of them asked how long we had been married. Before I could answer, Victoria laughed and said, "Nathan spends more time around construction crews than people like us." Everyone smiled politely. I smiled too. But on the drive home, I could not stop thinking about it. The comment seemed harmless on the surface, yet something about it lingered. Looking back now, I understand why. It was not a joke. It was a glimpse into how she saw me. Another memory surfaced while I sat at the kitchen table that morning. A company dinner the year before. Victoria spent most of the evening talking with coworkers. Every time I joined the conversation, it felt as though I was interrupting something. Nobody was rude. Nobody told me to leave. Yet I felt like a guest standing outside a house that used to belong to me. There were dozens of moments like that. Small enough to ignore. Easy to excuse. But when enough of them accumulate, they create a pattern. The coffee had gone cold before I noticed. Morning sunlight was beginning to creep through the windows when I heard footsteps upstairs. Victoria entered the kitchen, carrying her phone. She glanced at me briefly. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. She poured coffee into a travel mug and immediately checked a message on her screen. A smile appeared on her face. Not because of anything happening in the room. Because of something happening somewhere else. Then she picked up her purse. "I have meetings all day," she said. "I might be late." "Okay." She nodded and headed toward the door. A few seconds later, I heard her car pull out of the driveway. The silence that followed felt different than it used to. Less painful. More revealing. Sitting there alone, surrounded by the life I had spent decades building, I finally admitted something to myself. The saddest part was not that Victoria no longer saw me. The saddest part was how long I had accepted being unseen. Nobody destroys a marriage with one sentence. Most of the time, it happens through 1,000 smaller ones. That realization stayed with me during the weeks that followed. Once I stopped making excuses for everything, I started seeing patterns that had been there all along. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere. I had simply convinced myself they were normal. One memory kept returning to me. It was a Saturday afternoon about 2 years earlier. Victoria and I were attending a neighborhood barbecue hosted by friends. The weather was perfect. Children played in the yard. Music drifted from outdoor speakers. People stood around talking while hamburgers cooked on the grill. At one point, the conversation turned to careers. Someone asked me about a large commercial renovation project my company had recently completed. Before I could answer, Victoria smiled and said, "Nathan loves talking about construction. If you get him started, you will be here all day." Everyone laughed politely. I laughed too. The conversation moved on. At the time, I told myself it was harmless. But what I remember most is what happened afterward. Another guest asked Victoria about her latest marketing campaign. For the next 20 minutes, everyone listened attentively while she explained every detail. Nobody interrupted. Nobody made jokes. Nobody dismissed what she had to say. Driving home that evening, I stared through the windshield and wondered why I felt so small. Another memory surfaced. My 46th birthday. I had never been the type of person who needed elaborate celebrations. A quiet dinner was enough. That morning began like every other. I went to work, attended meetings, visited job sites. Throughout the day, my phone filled with messages from friends, employees, and family members wishing me a happy birthday. Victoria never called. She never texted. When I arrived home that evening, she was sitting on the couch responding to emails. Halfway through dinner, she glanced at her phone calendar and froze. "Oh no," she said. "Today was your birthday." She looked genuinely surprised. I told her not to worry about it. She apologized. We ordered dessert. Life continued. Yet something about that moment stayed with me. Not because she forgot a date, because forgetting had become easier than paying attention. Then there were the dinners. Hundreds of ordinary dinners. Some of the loneliest moments of my life happened while sitting 3 feet away from my wife. I would ask about her day. She would answer while scrolling through her phone. I would tell a story about work. She would nod without looking up. Sometimes entire conversations felt like interviews conducted by one person. The house itself seemed to notice. The dining room grew quieter each year. The laughter became less frequent. The pauses between sentences became longer. What I failed to understand then was that silence can be just as damaging as conflict. One evening stands out more than the others. Victoria had invited several co-workers to dinner. I spent most of Saturday preparing the backyard and grilling food. Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. Later that night, I walked outside to bring in a few empty serving trays. Through the open patio door, I heard someone ask Victoria how she balanced such a demanding career with family life. She smiled and answered, "Honestly, I handle most things myself." The comment lasted only a few seconds. Nobody challenged it. Nobody questioned it. But I stood there holding a tray, wondering whether I had somehow imagined the last 20 years. The early mornings. The long workdays. The countless responsibilities nobody ever saw because they were always completed before becoming problems. Small moments. Small comments. Small disappointments. None of them seemed large enough to end a marriage. Yet together they formed something impossible to ignore. Sitting alone in my office late one evening, I began writing down memories. Not because I wanted evidence, because I wanted honesty. For years I had focused on preserving the relationship. Now I was finally looking at it clearly. And the clearer it became, the harder it was to pretend that anything would change on its own. The truth was uncomfortable. Victoria had stopped valuing me long before I overheard those words in the living room. The difference was that now I could finally see it too. Once you stop hoping someone will change, you begin planning for the possibility that they never will. That was where I found myself during the months that followed. I did not make dramatic announcements. I did not threaten to leave. I did not start arguments or look for opportunities to prove a point. In fact, from the outside, my life probably appeared exactly the same. I still went to work every morning. I still came home every evening. I still asked Victoria about her day. I still attended social events when necessary. The difference was invisible. For the first time in years, I was no longer investing my energy into fixing something that only one person seemed interested in saving. Instead, I started preparing for a future that did not depend on anyone else's approval. The strange thing was that once I made that decision, everything became easier. Not happier. Easier. The constant disappointment began to fade. The endless cycle of expectation and frustration lost its grip on me. I stopped wondering whether Victoria would notice me. I stopped wondering whether she would appreciate me. I stopped wondering whether the next conversation would somehow repair what had been slowly breaking for years. One cold November morning, I scheduled a meeting with an attorney named Richard Bennett. His office occupied the 10th floor of a downtown Denver building overlooking the city skyline. Snow rested on rooftops in the distance, and sunlight reflected off the glass towers surrounding the business district. Richard was calm, professional, and surprisingly direct. After listening to my situation for nearly an hour, he leaned back in his chair and asked a simple question. "What outcome are you hoping for?" I stared out the window for several seconds before answering. "Peace." He nodded slowly. "That is usually the healthiest answer." Walking back to my truck afterward, I felt something I had not experienced in a very long time. Relief. Not because my problems had disappeared, because I had finally stopped pretending they did not exist. Over the following weeks, I handled everything quietly. Financial documents were organized. Accounts were reviewed. Legal questions were answered. Important records were copied and secured. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was emotional. Every step felt practical, methodical, the same way I approached a construction project. Build the foundation correctly, and the structure will stand. Meanwhile, Victoria remained completely unaware. She continued moving through life as though nothing had changed. Looking back now, I do not blame her for that. People rarely notice what they assume will always be there. One evening, She returned home excited about a major presentation she had delivered. We sat in the kitchen while she described the meeting in great detail. I listened carefully, asked questions, congratulated her. She smiled and thanked me. Then she stood up and headed upstairs. The entire conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes. During that time, she never once asked about my day. Years earlier, that realization would have hurt. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. December arrived with heavy snowstorms across Colorado. Holiday lights appeared throughout the neighborhood. Families decorated homes. Stores filled with shoppers. The world looked festive and bright. Yet inside our house, everything felt strangely distant. One Saturday afternoon, while Victoria attended a networking event, I visited an apartment on the other side of the city. The building overlooked a small park lined with pine trees. The apartment itself was modest. One bedroom, simple furniture, large windows facing west toward the mountains. Nothing luxurious, nothing impressive. Yet standing there alone in the quiet, I felt more comfortable than I had felt in years. The sunlight pouring through the windows painted long golden shapes across the hardwood floor. Outside, children played near a frozen pond while dog walkers followed winding paths through the park. It was peaceful, honest, real. For the first time, I could actually picture a different life. Not a better life, not a worse life, just a life where I no longer felt invisible. As I signed the lease a few days later, I realized something important. I was not running away from Victoria. I was moving toward myself. The decision had been forming for years. The comments, the neglect, the loneliness, the laughter from that night in the living room. All of it had led here. Victoria still believed everything was normal. She still believed tomorrow would look exactly like today. What she did not know was that every document I signed, every meeting I attended, and every quiet step I took was bringing me closer to becoming the one thing she never expected me to be. Gone. The day I left arrived without drama. No raised voices. No slammed doors. No final confrontation designed to leave lasting scars. Looking back, that felt appropriate. Our marriage had not fallen apart in a single explosive moment. It had faded quietly over many years, and its ending followed the same pattern. It was a Tuesday morning in January. Fresh snow covered the neighborhood, turning every rooftop and sidewalk bright beneath the winter sun. Victoria left for work shortly after 7. She stood in the kitchen finishing her coffee while scrolling through emails on her phone. I stood near the counter reviewing a project schedule. Everything looked ordinary. Everything sounded ordinary. I have meetings most of the day, she said. I might be late tonight. Okay, I replied. She picked up her purse, walked toward the door, and paused briefly. See you later. See you later. Then she was gone. I watched her car disappear down the street through the front window. For a few seconds, the house felt completely still. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt like standing at the edge of a lake before sunrise, knowing something important was about to begin. I took a slow breath and looked around the home we had shared for nearly 2 decades. Family photographs lined the hallway. Vacation souvenirs filled shelves. The dining table sat exactly where it had sat for years. Every room contained evidence of a life we had built together. Yet the emotional connection that gave those objects meaning had disappeared long ago. By 8 o'clock, I was moving. Not emotionally. Practically. Most of the preparation had already been completed during the previous weeks. Important documents had been organized. Personal belongings had been packed gradually and discreetly. Legal arrangements were already in place. The apartment lease had been signed. Financial matters had been reviewed with Richard Bennett. Nothing was rushed. Every step had been carefully planned. Around mid-morning, movers arrived to collect the remaining items that belonged exclusively to me. There were fewer than most people would expect. Years of experience had taught me that a person needs surprisingly little to start over. A few pieces of furniture, clothing, family keepsakes, tools, business records. The rest could stay behind. As the final boxes were loaded into the truck, I walked through the house one last time. The living room was quiet. The kitchen looked unchanged. Sunlight streamed through the windows and reflected across the hardwood floors. For a moment, memories surfaced. Holidays, birthday dinners, summer evenings spent on the patio. None of those memories were fake. That was what made everything so complicated. There had been good years, real years, happy years. But good memories cannot sustain a relationship forever. Eventually, two people must continue choosing each other. Somewhere along the way, We stopped. Shortly before leaving, I placed an envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside were the documents Victoria would need, along with contact information for Richard. There were no accusations, no emotional speeches, no attempt to make her feel guilty. Just facts. Clear, respectful, final. Then I picked up my keys and walked toward the front door. The cold air greeted me the moment I stepped outside. Snow crunched beneath my shoes. The mountains stood in the distance beneath a cloudless Colorado sky. For a second, I looked back at the house. Not because I was having second thoughts, because I wanted to remember the moment accurately. People often imagine that freedom arrives with excitement. Mine arrived with calm. I closed the door and walked away. By late afternoon, I was sitting in my new apartment watching the sunlight fade beyond the mountains. The room was simple, but it felt peaceful. Around 6 o'clock, my phone lit up with Victoria's name. I let it ring. A few minutes later, another call arrived. Then another. Shortly after that, a text message appeared. "Where are you?" 10 minutes later came another. "Nathan." Then a third. "What is happening?" I stared at the screen without responding. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted her to panic. The truth was simpler. For years, I had tried to explain what was happening inside our marriage. The difference now was that I had finally stopped explaining. As darkness settled outside my apartment window, the messages continued arriving. Confusion, concern, frustration, questions searching for answers. Meanwhile, for the first time in a very long time, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed. Peace. For the first few weeks after I left, Victoria seemed to treat my absence like an inconvenience rather than a loss. At least that was the impression I received through the occasional messages that appeared on my phone. Most of them were practical questions. Where was a certain document stored? Which company handled the annual furnace inspection? What was the password for an old utility account? None of the messages were hostile. None of them were emotional. They felt like someone trying to locate tools that had quietly disappeared from a workshop. I answered when necessary, always politely and briefly. Then I returned to my own life. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. The peace I felt on that first evening in the apartment did not fade. It grew. Every morning, I woke up before sunrise and watched the city slowly come alive beyond my windows. The apartment overlooked a small park, and during the winter months the walking paths were often covered in frost. Dog walkers appeared before dawn. Joggers moved through the cold air, wearing heavy jackets. The world kept moving forward, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving with it instead of standing still. Work became easier too. Without the constant emotional weight I had been carrying, my attention sharpened. Projects that once felt exhausting became manageable. New opportunities appeared. A commercial developer I had been pursuing for nearly a year finally agreed to meet. 2 months later, that meeting turned into one of the largest contracts my company had ever secured. The success felt rewarding, but not for the reason most people would assume. It was not about money. It was proof that I had not been the problem I spent years believing I was. While my life gradually settled into a healthier rhythm, Victoria's life appeared to be moving in the opposite direction. Richard Bennett called me one afternoon regarding a routine legal matter. Near the end of the conversation, he hesitated before speaking again. "I should probably stay out of personal observations," he said, "but she seems overwhelmed." After the call ended, I sat quietly at my desk for several minutes. Overwhelmed. The word stayed with me, not because I felt satisfaction, because I understood exactly what it meant. For years, countless responsibilities had been completed before they became visible. Property maintenance, insurance renewals, financial reviews, contractor scheduling, vehicle servicing, tax preparation, home repairs, emergency planning. Most people never notice those things when they are done properly. They only notice when nobody is doing them anymore. A few weeks later, a message arrived from Victoria late on a Saturday evening. The water heater stopped working. "Do you remember who installed it?" I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It was such a simple question. Yet hidden inside, it was a truth neither of us had fully understood before. For years, she never needed to know who installed it because she never had to think about it. Problems appeared and somehow disappeared. Appointments were scheduled. Repairs were handled. Details were managed. Life functioned smoothly because someone was quietly paying attention. I sent her the contractor's information and wished her luck. She responded with a simple thank you. Nothing more. As spring approached, the messages became less frequent. Not because things were improving, because she was learning, handling responsibilities herself, solving problems herself, facing the reality of daily life without the support she had once taken for granted. Looking back now, I think that period was important for both of us. I was learning that peace did not require anyone else's approval. Victoria was learning that freedom and absence were not the same thing. One afternoon, while sitting at a coffee shop overlooking the park, I noticed families enjoying the warmer weather. Children rode bicycles along the paths. Couples walked hand in hand beneath newly green trees. Sunlight reflected across a small pond near the center of the park. Watching them, I realized something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. I was happy, not because Victoria was struggling, not because I had escaped. I was happy because I had finally stopped measuring my value through someone else's eyes. And while I was beginning to build a future, Victoria was only beginning to understand the true cost of the past. By the time autumn returned to Colorado, nearly a year had passed since I walked out of the house. The legal process continued moving forward, but emotionally, I was no longer living inside the past. My company had expanded. New contracts filled the calendar. Employees I had hired during the previous year were thriving. Most importantly, I had stopped waking up every morning carrying the weight of trying to prove my worth. Life was not perfect, but it felt honest. Looking back, I think that was the biggest difference. For years, I had been performing the role of a husband in a marriage that no longer functioned. Now I was simply living. One afternoon, Richard Bennett called regarding a routine update. Before ending the conversation, he paused for a moment. "I ran into Victoria recently," he said. "She seems different." I remembered the same observation he had made months earlier. "Different how?" I asked. Richard thought for a second. "Quieter." After the call ended, that word stayed with me. Quieter. There was a time when Victoria filled every room with energy. She always seemed to be moving toward the next goal, the next project, the next achievement. The idea of her becoming quiet felt strange. Yet part of me understood exactly why it had happened. Sometimes people only recognize the value of stability after it disappears. During the following weeks, small pieces of information reached me through mutual acquaintances. Nobody was gossiping. Nobody was trying to interfere. These were simply observations that surfaced naturally. Victoria no longer attended many social gatherings. She spent less time with the same group of friends who had once occupied so much of her schedule. She had become more private, more reflective. One evening, while reviewing plans for a new commercial project, I received an unexpected email from Amanda Foster. She had been one of Victoria's closest friends for years. More importantly, she had been sitting in that living room on the night everything changed. Her message was brief. She apologized for things she had witnessed and never questioned. She admitted there were moments when she should have spoken up, but chose the easier path instead. I read the message twice before closing my laptop. The apology did not change anything, but it confirmed something important. The story I had spent years telling myself was real. I had not imagined the disrespect. I had not exaggerated the loneliness. Other people had seen it too. They simply did not understand the consequences until it was too late. Around the same time, I learned that Victoria had taken over every responsibility that once operated quietly in the background of our life together. Financial planning, home maintenance, contractor appointments, insurance reviews, tax preparation, long-term budgeting. None of those tasks were impossible. In fact, she handled them competently. But competence was not the lesson. The lesson was awareness. For the first time, she could see how much effort had existed beneath the surface all those years. One Saturday morning, I stopped by a coffee shop near the park outside my apartment. The trees had begun changing color, painting the landscape with shades of gold and red. Families walked along the trails. Children chased each other through piles of fallen leaves. I sat near the window with a cup of coffee and watched the world move around me. The feeling that settled over me was difficult to describe. It was not happiness in the traditional sense. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the quiet. Gratitude for the clarity. Gratitude for finally understanding that self-respect is not something another person gives you. It is something you decide to keep. Then, several weeks later, everything came full circle. My company was invited to a large business networking event at a luxury hotel in downtown Denver. The ballroom was crowded with developers, investors, executives, and local business leaders. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the room, while the city skyline glowed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was speaking with several clients when I noticed movement across the ballroom. Victoria had just arrived with colleagues from her firm. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the crowded room. Almost a year earlier, I would have wondered what she thought of me. Standing there that night, I realized something surprising. The question no longer mattered. And for the first time since our marriage began to fall apart, I understood that the most painful thing a person can lose is not a relationship. It is the chance to appreciate it while it still exists. 2 weeks after the networking event, I received a message I had been expecting for months. It arrived on a quiet Thursday evening while I sat at my dining table reviewing project estimates. Outside, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. The city lights shimmered across the wet streets below. My phone vibrated once. Then again. When I looked down, I saw Victoria's name. The message was simple. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting the phone aside. There was a time when a message from her would have consumed my thoughts for hours. There was a time when I would have immediately wondered what she needed, what she was feeling, or how I could help. Now I simply returned to my paperwork. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish her, because my life no longer revolved around her reactions. The following morning, I finally responded. "What would you like to talk about?" Her reply arrived less than a minute later. "Please, just one conversation." Something in the wording felt different. There was no frustration, no expectation, just sincerity. After thinking about it for a while, I agreed to meet her on Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop near downtown Denver. The same city we had both called home for years now felt strangely neutral. As Saturday approached, I found myself surprisingly calm. I was not nervous. I was not excited. I was simply curious. When the day arrived, the weather was perfect for early fall. The sky was clear, and the air carried that familiar Colorado crispness that arrives before winter. I arrived a few minutes early and chose a table near the window. Sunlight streamed across the wooden floor while customers quietly worked on laptops or talked with friends. It was the kind of place where ordinary conversations happened every day. A few minutes later, Victoria walked through the front door. For a moment, I barely recognized her. Not because she looked dramatically different, because something about her presence had changed. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly seemed softer now, more thoughtful, more grounded. She spotted me and slowly approached the table. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," I replied. She sat down across from me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence was not hostile. It simply felt honest. Finally, Victoria looked down at her coffee cup and took a deep breath. "I have replayed this conversation in my head for months," she said quietly. I listened, and every version starts with an apology. She paused before continuing. "I am sorry, Nathan." Her voice did not tremble. She was not looking for sympathy. She was telling the truth. "For a long time, I blamed everything except myself," she said. "It was easier that way." She gave a small, sad smile. "I convinced myself that if certain things changed, I would finally be happy. I kept looking for reasons outside myself." I remained silent. Some people interrupt because they are eager to respond. I stayed quiet because I wanted to understand. Victoria stared out the window for a moment before continuing. "After you left, I thought I would feel relieved." Her eyes returned to mine. Instead, I started noticing everything I never appreciated. The words hung between us. "Not just the responsibilities," she said. "Not just the things you handled. I started noticing your absence." Looking back, I think that was the moment I realized how much she had changed. She was no longer talking about convenience. She was talking about connection. "The house felt different," she continued. "The routines felt different. Even the quiet felt different." She laughed softly and shook her head. It took losing something to understand what it was worth. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she looked directly at me. "I took you for granted." There it was. The truth neither of us had been able to say for years. Simple, direct, honest. "I know," I said gently. Victoria nodded. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply accepted it. Then her expression softened even more. "I miss you, Nathan." The words carried no manipulation, no hidden agenda, just regret, real regret. And as I sat across from her in that quiet coffee shop, I realized that what she was saying would have meant everything to the man I used to be. The difference was that I was no longer that man. I looked at Victoria for several seconds before answering. The coffee shop remained quiet around us. Outside, people walked beneath trees covered in autumn colors while sunlight reflected across the sidewalks. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon. It was an ordinary afternoon, yet somehow it felt like the final page of a chapter that had taken years to write. "I believe you," I said softly. Victoria lowered her eyes and nodded. Relief crossed her face for a moment, followed by sadness. "Thank you," she whispered. I leaned back slightly and looked out the window. There was a time when hearing those words from her would have changed everything. There was a time when I would have viewed her regret as hope. But life has a way of teaching lessons that cannot be unlearned. "I wish I had understood sooner," she said quietly. "I know," I replied. The truth was that I did know. I knew because I had spent years wishing the same thing. Wishing she would notice. Wishing she would appreciate what we had before it slipped away. Wishing she would see me the way she once did. The difference was that those wishes belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. Victoria looked at me carefully. "Do you ever think about us?" she asked. It was an honest question, not designed to persuade, not designed to reopen old wounds. Just honest. I thought about it before answering. "Sometimes," I said. "I think about the good years. I think about the memories. I think about the life we built together." She smiled faintly. Then she waited. "And?" she asked. I took a slow breath. "And then I remember that memories are not enough to build a future." The smile disappeared. Not because she disagreed. Because she understood. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different than the silence we shared during our marriage. Back then it had been filled with distance. This silence contained understanding. Eventually Victoria nodded. "You are right," she said. There was no argument. No attempt to convince me otherwise. Just acceptance. Looking back, I think that was the most meaningful part of the conversation. Not the apology. Not the regret. The acceptance. Sometimes closure arrives when two people finally stop fighting reality. Victoria stared at her coffee cup before speaking again. "I really am sorry, Nathan." Her voice was calm, genuine, honest. "I know," I said, "and I appreciate that." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled sadly. "You seem happy." The question was hidden inside the observation. I understood what she was really asking. "I am," I answered. "Not because everything is perfect, just because I finally found peace." She nodded slowly. A part of me wished she had found hers too. Despite everything that happened, I did not hate Victoria. I never did. The opposite of love is not hatred. It is indifference. And what I felt sitting across from her was not anger. It was acceptance. Eventually we stood from the table. Neither of us rushed the moment. There was no dramatic farewell. No final speech. Just two people acknowledging that life had taken them in different directions. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," I replied. Then she turned and walked toward the door. I watched her leave. For a moment, sunlight followed her across the sidewalk outside. Then she disappeared into the flow of the city. I remained there for several minutes, finishing my coffee and reflecting on everything that had happened. The strange thing was that I did not feel victorious. I did not feel like I had won anything. What I felt was gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons. Gratitude for the growth. Gratitude for finally understanding that self-respect is not something another person gives you. It is something you choose for yourself. A few months later, the divorce was finalized. Life continued moving forward. My company continued growing. New opportunities appeared. Friendships deepened. The future felt open again. And every now and then, I would remember that night when everything began. The night a careless sentence revealed a truth neither of us was ready to face. In the end, she got exactly what she thought she wanted. The difference was that by the time she understood what she had lost, I had already found peace. Before this story ends, I would genuinely love to know your thoughts. If you were in Nathan's position, would you have made the same decision, or would you have chosen a different path? Share your perspective in the comments because every experience offers a different lesson. And if stories about resilience, self-respect, personal growth, and finding peace after difficult chapters speak to you, consider subscribing so you can join us for more journeys like this in the future. Sometimes the most powerful endings are not about revenge. They are about finally learning your worth and having the courage to keep moving forward.